Hey folks, and welcome back to the One.Stop.Over podcast audio recordings. I really appreciate you joining me today. And for those of you who have continued to follow, subscribe, and comment on my existing Substack work, I really appreciate you joining me in this journey. I'm super excited with how the Substack community is growing, and I'm really privileged and honored to be a part of this. And for those of you who are new here, my name's Tom, and I'm a photographer from New Jersey. Today, what I'd like to talk about is something that I think all of us have been seeing a lot of on all social media channels and on Substack also, is the discussion around AI and its impact on those of us that are creatives. I've recently read two really interesting pieces, and I will link those in this video at the end, from the page of Just Susie and also the page of Matt Barr, where he interviewed two people who had opposing views on AI, and it was really interesting reading. Got me thinking about how I felt about AI and what its place is. So I think, first of all, most people assume that as a photographer I'd be threatened by AI, and I think if you're in some particular sectors of the industry, and if you're a working photographer, which I'm not, but if you're a working photographer, you may have some concerns about what AI might do for as far as either replacing you for client work, what it might do as far as taking your images and using those images to train AI without your permission. And I think these are useful discussion points that we need to have. But I would also say that I think that AI does have the ability to improve our lives, but we've got to be careful about how we integrate it into our lives, and also what we do to make sure that we don't lose control of our creative process. And what I find interesting is we've had these recent growths in a return to analog. Also, when you look at the sort of demographic that are returning to things like film and vinyl and cassette, they tend to be this younger generation that did not have access to those things when they were children. And I was born in the 80s, and so I remember what life was like before digital and after. And I guess I was young enough to be able to integrate all these new technologies into my life without having too much of a problem. But I was also old enough to have some level of nostalgia over them, which I think is one of the reasons I've returned to a lot of these things later in life. My concern around AI is not so much the vulnerability of a working photographer's standpoint, because it doesn't impact me directly. What I'm concerned about is how AI is used to distort information. And from a journalistic standpoint, I think it's really important that we remain and maintain the integrity of photographic images. And this is something that concerns me because we've already seen AI images being generated and passed off as real. We've already seen quote-unquote real photographs altered heavily with AI and then passed off as unaltered, and then later on it's found out that the photographer had manipulated the image. And I think sometimes we look at these bigger cases and we don't necessarily see that there are benefits to some of these tools. If you look at some of the things that have been added to our digital workflow from a photographer's standpoint recently, spot removal, all of these things that are integrated into platforms like Photoshop, they're really super useful, and they are AI. But where do we draw the line? And I think that's an individual question that we can only answer ourselves. Personally, I think some of the imagery that's being created with use of AI is incredible. I can still tell the difference between, I think for most instances, a real photograph and an AI created image. But obviously, there are situations out there whereby this has become difficult. We've got instances where a photographer entered deliberately an AI image into the Sony World Photographer competition a couple of years ago and managed to pass it off as a real image. And then when he was awarded the prize for that particular competition, he declared that it was an AI image and he'd done this as a test. So I do think we have to be careful. I do think that real photography still has a really strong place in the world. And I think that more and more film photography will be something that people return to, because there is no recreation of that image. We still have the negative that we can return to and show someone this is actually what we captured. So I think it's an interesting discussion. I believe that there's space for both AI created imagery and photography. Anything that helps somebody tap their creative spirit and utilize that part of their brain, and if they find benefit and derive joy from doing it, I'm all for that. I think where we have to be careful is when we start passing off AI images as legitimate photographs when they're not. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. I'm not a working photographer, so I'm not looking at it from the standpoint as how this may impact my income. I do think there is valid concerns within the industry. Certain genres of photography and certain sectors of the business may be heavily impacted in this area. And I also think outside of photography, there are some benefits to AI, but also concerns as well. So I'll make sure I reference those articles that I talked about earlier on in the notes for this recording. Again, I really appreciate your time here, and thank you for following me. I'd love to hear your feedback on what you think AI can do both positively and what it might do negatively to the industry and photography as a whole. And thanks for following. I appreciate it. Bye.